Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Joe, Smokin Joe's BBQ. On today's video, I'm going to show you how to trim up a brisket. This happens to be a 22-pound brisket. You don't want to miss this. Stay tuned. As you can see, look at this bark. It's crazy.
Oh man, this is perfect.
It helps to start with a nice sharp knife, okay?
Oh my goodness.
Look at that. All right, so what we've got here is a 22-pound brisket from Midland Meat Company. And this is a monster brisket. This is probably the largest brisket that I've ever purchased and trimmed. And I got to tell you, it's the entire length of this chopping board. And this chopping board is a long chopping board, so you can see the size of it. This is the same brisket that a lot of competition cooks are cooking for big competitions. I know that Fred Robles, that just actually won a big barbecue cook-off. He actually uses these briskets from Midland Meat Company. There's a lot of other cooks out there that cook these briskets from Midland Meat Company, and they are gorgeous. I got to tell you that I've smoked plenty of Snake River Farms briskets. Actually, I don't want to say plenty, but I've smoked probably 4 or 5 Snake River Farm briskets, and they're good. But the marbling on these briskets is absolutely amazing, okay? Now, this is a very large brisket, a competition trim. They would separate the flat from the point. Many competition cooks will do that. I'm not gonna do that. This is gonna be more of a backyard trim, if you will. So the knives that I am using, I'm using a fillet knife. This is a Hammerstall knife. And the second knife that I'm using is a chef's knife from Cut, the K-U-T-T company. These are the only 2 knives that I usually use for trimming briskets. So the first thing that I start with is this flat part, trimming the flat. Again, this is absolutely gorgeous. Midland Meat Company does a decent job of trimming these already. So not a whole lot of trimming has to go into this, but I like to trim it up a little bit more. And I did see some things that I'm going to remove as well. Now, I usually just throw the trimmings, throw them away. But because this is a Wagyu brisket, is a premium brisket, I'm going to save it and I'm going to freeze it. I'm going to vacuum seal it and save it. I plan on making sausage here pretty soon, so I'm going to be using this brisket for that. So here's our flat, and I like to start here on my flat. Again, very little trimming, if anything, just in this little area. It's got some fat. Maybe I'll trim these pieces here. This fat seam right here, you don't want to start gouging into it because it can get away from you and it'll affect the overall product. So just be careful with this. And I will remove some of this decal fat as well. So again, I like to start with the flat. So I'm just gonna guide my knife on top of this brisket like this. Okay. And again, I just sharpen these knives. So they're pretty sharp. I'm not too worried about removing all of the silver skin. That doesn't bother me at all. And one trick, just kind of lift the brisket from the bottom to help raise the brisket up a little bit. And just glide your knife on top of this brisket just like this. Be careful. I'm also wearing a cut knife, which you see here. That way if my knife slips, I'm protected there. So again, just glide your knife on the top just like this and start removing some of this fat. Okay. A little bit more. I'm probably going to trim this edge off anyway, so I'm not worried too much about that. Again, just remove the heavier pockets of fat, if you will. Lay your knife nice and flat. Okay. That looks good there. I'm going to trim. Actually, I'm going to remove this piece here. I'm going to show you why I'm going to remove this whole piece right here in a little bit, a good chunk of it anyway. So now as far as the decal, let me flip this over so you guys can see this. So this is our decal fat here. And this is where I pull out my chef's knife. And I'm just going to start removing a little bit more of this decal fat here. Okay, you can kind of see where that goes. And the reason I use my chef's knife is because this fat is a little harder than most of the fat on this brisket. So I also want to make sure that I don't have any sharp edges on this brisket. And if I develop one, just trim it down just like that. That way the smoke flows right over the brisket. Now this is a very small, the decal is very small on this brisket. I mean, I've seen small briskets where this whole side is filled with nothing but the that decal fat. So I'm pretty pleased with that. I'm also going to remove some of this fat here. Just like that. You can start to see the beautiful marbling on this brisket here too. Man, that is gorgeous. I will tell you that a lot of competition cooks, this is that fat seam that separates the flat from the point. All you got to do is start trimming into this and start separating if you wanted to at this point. Okay, if you're gonna separate it, but I'm not gonna separate. I'm just doing a light trim, if you will. Remove some of this fat here. Maybe just a little bit more. Okay, that looks good. Now this, it is kind of bumpy right here, so I'm going to remove this. Just like this. Okay, I want it nice and smooth, as I mentioned. Remove that corner there. There you go, it's nice and round there. Okay, so this looks really good right here. This point, it does have a little, kind of this little ball of meat right here. Hopefully you guys can see that. There we go. So I'm gonna trim that down. Again, I want this as smooth and as round as possible. So just trim this down. Now this brisket, I did have it in my fridge, thawing out for a couple of days, and I cranked the temperature up in my fridge. So it's not 100% frozen, but it's still, you can see that it's a little stiff, and that's the way I like to trim my briskets. It's a little easier to trim a cold brisket than your room temperature brisket for sure. So I'm just kind of rounding this off here. Okay, that looks good. So now the point is really nice and round here. Now, one thing that I like to do since I've got my chef's knife, first of all, look at how thick this flat is. This is probably a good 1.25 inches. With the fat, it's probably 1.5 inches. I mean, this is just a really nice flat. Now, these are dry aged from Midland Meat Company, but I still like to clean up the edge. Okay? Just like that. Look at that. Look at how beautiful this is. Man, that looks good. Now, as far as the front portion here, I also like to take some of this off. Probably going to take about, well, let's say 1/4 inch off. Okay, I like to start with a nice, just kind of round this corner off here. Just like that. So I like to see what I'm dealing with right here. So now I do have it is nice and thick here, and it kind of gets a little thinner on this side. Let me turn this so you guys can see it right there. So it is a little bit thinner there. So what I like to do there is, actually I'm going to grab my fillet knife. I'm just going to round off this corner right here. Probably from here to here. I'm just going to round that off. You stand on this side. Just kind of make your line. Okay. There we go. So you can see this is still pretty good. I'm not going to throw this away, but the flat is a little thin there. Okay. It's a little bit better there. In fact, I'm going to take off a little bit more. Just kind of. Just like this. Again, this is just a backyard trim. Looks good right there. Now, this is just the flat portion of it. Now it's time to trim the fat on the opposite end. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm going to trim some of this off. Now, if I was separating this, I would probably trim a good portion of this right here because it is a little thin. But if you look on this, actually, let me flip it here. Now, this is a big brisket, okay? So, here we go. So, this is still part of the flat, and this is the fat side. So, to me, this piece is probably going to cook really fast while the rest of it's, going to cook a little bit slower. So I'm going to remove a good portion of this, this right here. Okay. And I'm using my big chef's knife. I'm going to turn this towards me just to make it a little bit easier for me. Here we go. And I'll show you what it looks like after I get done trimming this. Okay. Okay, now this is a big piece of meat, so I'm not going to toss that away. Okay, trim a little bit more off. There we go. So now my brisket is looking a little bit better. You can see what I did here. Okay, so I removed that big chunk of meat, exposing, a good section of meat here. Now I'm going to trim some of this fat here as well. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I like to start with a nice, fresh edge, just like this. Okay, so that's about it on this side. Now, because these briskets are dry aged, you might get a little bit of these dark spots, okay? Nothing, no big deal, but you can trim some of this off if you wanted to. So just grab I'm using my fillet knife here. You can take that right off. It's not gonna hurt anything. Okay, that looks good. The fat cap. Okay, so my fat cap here actually looks pretty good. On this side, towards the front of it, let me remove this. Actually, it's just hanging there. So right here, towards the front, I'm happy with that. Right here, I got a little bit heavier fat pocket. So I'm gonna trim a little bit of that off. Again, just lay your knife nice and flat and take some of this fat off. And you'll know how deep you can go because you'll start to see, like right here, these little windows. There's still fat here, but I can see the meat here. So I'm just gonna trim a little bit of this. A little bit more of this. There we go. So now I'm gonna see how we look there. I can take off a little bit more here. Okay, that looks good right there. So again, we started with a 22-pound brisket, and now we're down to, I've probably taken off 2 pounds. So we're probably sitting at 20 pounds, maybe 19 and a half pounds. And this is what I'm looking for. Now I am gonna take off some of this heavy fat here on this point as well, but also trying to keep the point nice and round. And all briskets they're not too much different, okay? I know this is a Wagyu brisket from Midland Meat Company, but the brisket really, you know, they don't change a whole lot. Now you'll have a left side and a right side, and sometimes this point meat right here, sometimes you'll have to trim it down a little bit, but this one's already laying kind of flat already. I'm gonna clean this up just a little bit more. There we go. That's simple. Again, I don't want anything stopping that smoke. I want the smoke just to, actually it's gonna flow this way over the brisket. Trim a little bit of this. Okay. Take some of this off just so that it's even. Actually, I'm going to grab my chef's knife to do this. There we go. So you can see the brisket is nice and flat now on this, on the fat cap. Okay, so this looks good. I'm happy with the fat cap, how thick the fat cap is on this side. Now, depending on what type of smoker you have, if the majority of the heat is coming from the top, you want to cook this fat cap up. If your heat's coming from the bottom, you want to cook it with the flat on the top, with the fat cap down. Now, either way, you want this brisket to sit flat inside your smoker, just like it sits here. It's nice and flat. There's nothing getting in the way, nothing stopping that smoke from going over this brisket. I am going to be cooking this fat cap down. In this video, I'm not going to cook it, but I will be filming a video here. You guys will see that here pretty soon as well. So overall, really happy. Actually, a little bumpy here. Just clean that up a little bit. There we go. That's how easy it is to clean up a brisket. So don't be intimidated by a brisket, guys. This is a, you know, fairly expensive brisket from Midland Meat Company. It's one of the absolute best briskets. In fact, I'm gonna say it. I mean, this is the best brisket that I've ever cooked. I just haven't seen briskets with this kind of marbling. But don't be afraid. I mean, this is a pretty expensive brisket, whether it's a $40 brisket or a $200 brisket. Don't be afraid and practice, you know, practice your trimming. It's fairly easy. You don't have to make it terribly complicated. You just saw me trim this brisket. Again, I have probably 2 or 3 pounds here. So when it's all said and done, you know, about a 19-pound brisket ready to go in the smoker. Hope this helps you guys. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, leave them down below. And if this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Until next time, Joe with Smokin Joe's Pit BBQ. See you guys.